Okay, so if you've been watching me so far, we're talking about shameful things, shame, and the function of shame, why human beings have evolved this capacity to feel shame. I really find this topic interesting. I'm going to try and make this subject as therapeutic as possible so that hopefully we can help people, because that's how I roll. And I think I'm going to get there. So the second part of this topic on shame is that I want to talk about how shame can become pathological. And I'll use the example of a drug-addicted person and the fact that drug addiction is often called a disease of shame, in the sense that many people who are in recovery feel tremendous shame. And fighting shame or coming to terms with one's shame is an important part of the recovery process. So drug addiction, alcoholism, is a complicated condition. It's a complicated medical condition that we now know has a genetic component, what we call polymorphisms, where we see that there appear to be multiple sites in a person's genome that are associated with increased risk for becoming addicted to drugs and alcohol. We also know in studies on twins that were separated at birth, had no relationship with each other whatsoever because they were adopted, that in fact alcoholism and addiction does have a genetic component. But we also know that there are triggers, whether it's an environmental exposure, that's a component, simply being exposed to the substance, the drug or the alcohol, or to have a triggering incident like a trauma. In the case of, and the other thing I want to add to that is that it can also be the type of substance as well. For example, some substances are more addictive than others. Tobacco, for example, if you smoke cigarettes long enough, it has a very high rate of addiction. In fact, tobacco is one of the most addictive substances there is, and it's one of the hardest addictions to withdraw from, to cease to. And I know many people who are in recovery, they'll get through heroin, alcohol, cocaine, no problem, but they cannot give up their cigarettes. It is the toughest addiction to overcome, and I also want to say it's the most deadly of all the drug addictions out there. Tobacco claims the most lives in the United States. After that, alcohol. So shame is a huge component in the addicted person, and we know that there are many components to why a person can become addicted. There's a genetic component, and then there's environmental exposure, an opportunity to simply have the substance be available. There's also triggers that can be such as a shock or a trauma. Examples the 3 examples of traumas, exposure, and a genetic component with drug and alcohol addiction are being a member of the LGBTQ community, lesbian, gay, transgender, queer community. If you had that genetic component, and if you were exposed to an environment where there was a lot of shaming that was done because you didn't fit in with what the expectations were for you, you might be at greater risk of drug and alcohol abuse. Child abuse, child sexual abuse, physical abuse, trauma. Very common that we will see, particularly if a child is sexually abused early on. There's a sense of shame or confusion, particularly if they didn't get the familial support that they needed. They feel ashamed, they don't understand what's been done, so they place the shame on themselves. And then if there's a component or if they're at risk factors for drug and alcohol abuse, they're exposed to the drugs and alcohol abuse, the shame is compounded by drug and alcohol abuse. And then finally, I have here soldiers of war or any kind of a trauma. But I think that we see this in any kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, people who go off to war, and Vietnam vets who came back with a lot of alcoholism and heroin addiction would be an example of that. And then you wind up in a cycle of shame where you take a medication, you self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, and you feel better. You take the cocaine, you actually felt better when you were drinking. You felt relieved of your shame when you took the drugs and alcohol. And so you continue to take the drugs and alcohol because you feel better. It actually alleviates the pain. That's what we call self-medicating. The person's actually taking these illicit drugs because they are taking away the unpleasant feeling in the body of shame, because shame is a horrible feeling in the body. If it's a case of chronic shame, if you are chronically ashamed of yourself, happiness is going to be elusive. A person cannot be truly happy if they suffer from extreme chronic shame. You have to alleviate the suffering of shame if you are to be happy, truly happy. Yeah, I don't believe one can exist without the other. Healthy shame is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when it's pathological. The capacity to feel shame, as I mentioned, is healthy. When it's shame due to trauma or abuse, that's driving to these kinds of destructive behaviors. At that point, it's not healthy. It's toxic. So then it becomes a cycle, because what happens in the addicted person is that they feel shame and self-loathing because of trauma or whatnot, and then they feel weak because they're turning to drugs and alcohol, and society's expectations may be to get it together, stop hurting yourself, stop abusing yourself. Why can't you just put the drugs down? Why can't you just be a man? Why can't you just buck up? And so that just compounds the problem by creating more shame. And then that shame results in wanting to do drugs, because drugs become the remedy for the shame, and it becomes a circle. And then you need money for the drugs, so then to get out of the pain of withdrawal and the pain of the shame, you'll do anything in your power to get the drugs, which means committing illegal acts, stealing, robbing, prostitution, lying, whatever you need to do to get the drugs, which, you guessed it, results in more shame. So how do you get out of the shame? By doing more drugs, and the cycle continues and continues and continues. So the means to cure has become an interesting topic, and I think it's going to be a topic that will evolve for a very, very long time, as long as we deal with the epidemic of abuse in childhood, war, trauma, and other risk factors that can trigger this kind of behavior. Because if the underlying cause of the shame isn't dealt with, then I don't think we can really see cure. But I did have a couple notes. And the first note was to stabilize the patient to reduce cravings. That's the first line of defense, that in modern treatment for addiction recovery, the use of pharmaceuticals to help stabilize the patient, so that at the very least the patient is not going through extreme pain of withdrawal from the drugs. It's controversial, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and it's very complicated how to adequately stabilize the patient. There are natural means that we use to stabilize the patient. Sometimes they work, sometimes they aren't strong enough. It depends on what we're dealing with. The second is to do the spiritual work of resolving the shame, to find what the origins of the pain and the shame are. So in Alcoholics Anonymous, it begins by first acknowledging the problem, but then the person who's in recovery will make a list of the things they are ashamed of in an attempt to clean up the mess and sin no more. Try and clean up the mess to the best of your ability and sin no more. But it's a complicated subject, and it's that constant boat trying to make its way to shore, and it's going to be going kind of it's not a straight and narrow. It's kind of, but eventually you're going to get there. And then last thing I wanted to leave with is the demons of shame. That when we resolve unhealthy shame, when we come to terms with our shame for what it is and are able to clean up the mess of shame, the demons become weaker, because this idea of the demons of drug and alcohol, or the demons of shame, really, I think the demons are one and the same. Shame and the demons associated with drug and alcohol are really one and the same thing. That shame is really another name for the demons. Again, it serves a healthy function, which is to help us survive in a given society. But when it becomes unhealthy and when it becomes a trigger for self-abuse, at that point it becomes pathological. So I just want to leave it with that, saying that a demon is bound by the feelings of shame, and to heal shame is to break the hold of the demons. This is the path to recovery for the addicted person. Heal the shame, and there will no longer be a demon. That these constructed demons are constructed from shame. I will probably talk more about this in the future as I learn more, and I think it's a really interesting subject, and I'd like feedback. What do you think? What has been your experience of shame? How have you struggled with shame in your own life? How has shame been a good thing, and how has it been something that has kept you from becoming happy? So thank you for listening, and take care. Bye-bye. Oh, and be sure and share, like, subscribe, and thanks for listening. Bye.